Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I want to thank you all for joining us for this special program on covering political demonstrations and reporting on local protests. This presentation is part of NEFAC's First Amendment and Free Press program, where we bring journalists into the community to discuss how their newsrooms work, how journalists do their jobs. A special thanks to the Sun Journal and the Kennebec Journal for their help coordinating this event and providing two newsroom veterans to help us better understand how the media covers Maine. With us this evening, we have Judith Meyer. Judy's a NEFAC board member as well as executive editor of the Sun Journal, Kennebec Journal, and Morning Sentinel. Judy's been a journalist since 1990 and was named Maine's Journalist of the Year in 2003. Joining her is Joe Phelan. He's a photographer for the Kennebec Journal, and he's covered recent protests at the State House. Also at the Journal, he produces pictures and video that runs with sports, features, news stories, all appearing in Maine Today publications. We have just an hour this evening, and I want to get to as many questions as possible. I have a list of questions that many of you have submitted when you registered. I would encourage everyone to also use the Q&A function, the question and answer function that's right here in the webinar. Use that to ask any additional questions as we proceed, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can. Lastly, before we begin, please know that this program is intended as a way for all of us to productively and respectfully discuss issues within our communities and how they are covered. So if you do use the chat box, please be considerate with your comments and keep those comments on topic. So with all that said, let's get started. To begin the conversation, I think it would be helpful if we took a look at several photos and watch some video that Joe took at some recent protests near the State House. Joe, as we go through these images and hear this audio, can you provide us some context to what we're seeing here and help us understand why the decision was made to cover these protests? Why are they newsworthy?
That was from the summertime. Starting back in April, there were protests every week or two by the Blaine House and the State House in Augusta, and they were really big in the spring and summer like that one, and then kind of became smaller and less frequent as it went on. It mostly seemed to start as like reopen protests. That's what mostly they were protesting, and later it kind of became like stop the steal and reopen at the same time, like I don't know if we can flip through the pictures, Strawberry. Yeah, that's from earlier in the spring when it was a lot of people there, that they had the parade of cars kind of circling around the Blaine House and the State House. And if we just kind of keep flipping there, I had, that's actually a frame that was from the video, but that's the summertime. They were, they would kind of parade the cars, line up there. That was the only Confederate flag I ever saw. I was kind of looking for them, and but that was the only one. Mostly it was red, white, and blue and Trump. And that one was a smaller protest. It was like 3 or 4 Black Lives Matter people at the State House, and the governor had stopped to see them. This was the Saturday of the the governor just happened to be driving by and rolls down her window and stops and says hello to these people. This was a Saturday that the reopen people weren't there. That was the Stop the Steal, the first Saturday after the election, as they were marching around and chanting, and there they are going by the State House. And I think the last couple pictures were kind of as things got, yeah, that was in December, one of the first snowstorms. There were about a dozen people by the Blaine House, and that was the Saturday before the inauguration. There were about 10 people who kind of came and went over the course of the hour, but there were a whole lot more police than protesters that day, because that was the weekend everybody was worried that something might happen, and nothing did. So I think that was the last one.
So just looking at those photos, Joe, there's a difference in the causes that are represented at these assemblies. There's a difference in sizes, just how many people have gathered for these particular protests. Maybe you and Judy as well, can you give us some insight here to what goes on in the newsroom? What kind of conversations do you have when you're determining whether to cover a particular assembly or not? Do you give any of those circumstances consideration, or do you cover every assembly that happens in front of the State House, regardless of the message or size? How does it work?
We certainly couldn't cover them all. And, you know, the topic is important, the size of the crowd. Those all weigh into those decisions. But we do cover the State House really closely. And, you know, the State House is just one place where there's protests. There's protests and demonstrations across the state of Maine. Sometimes, you know, a woman will stand on a corner every day at noon and say something that she wants to be heard. And at some point we cover that because she has a message that she wants people to hear.
Joe, how about your own coverage? When you arrive on the scene, you see a number of people gathered, they're all here to assemble. What kind of judgments do you make as a photographer as to the particular images you want to capture and provide to the newsroom? Are there certain things that you're looking for, you know, specifically, or are you just capturing as much as possible, you know, without much consideration to the message, for example, or the specific people that are present?
It's a little both. You want to cover as much as you can while you're there. They would kind of do the parade for a half an hour, and then move on to speeches. And so you try to get kind of like a wide shot, a medium shot, and a close up. You just kind of get a variety of angles like that. So you get, if you get to make a slideshow out of several pictures, you try to get different views of the crowd to sort of tell the story in different ways.
And Judy, when you get these photos, when your reporters come back with all those news, all their reporting, you know, a question that was posed in all that we received prior to the event was, well, how do you make the determination, or what judgment do you use in taking all of that information and then providing it to the public? Whether you put it on, you know, the front page, is it an A1 photo? Is it something that's going to run on the inside? Like, what considerations do you have in making that judgment? Because obviously there are a lot of repercussions as to how much play you give a particular protest or demonstration. How do you judge its importance as far as your news coverage is concerned?
Well, you know what, a lot of people come out to a demonstration. It's evidence that it's really important to not just a handful of people, but a good cross section of people. And the photos will tell that story, and the words will tell that story. So if we can put that together that has real weight, that would be an A1 consideration. But we also have to be really careful that we're not just taking what we're hearing on the street and putting that message in our newspapers without challenge. It's really important that we provide the context for what is happening. And I know we covered a protest in Oxford Hills, the Sun Journal did, over the summer of the Mainers against masks. And it was 3 protesters. It was supposed to be hundreds, and we get there, there's only 3. We still covered it because they were a new group. And within, you know, a couple of weeks, they had a number of followers. But in the early reporting, we did not put in the CDC guidelines for masks and why the mandate was required. But as the reporting evolved, even a month later, when the KJ covered a very similar protest by the same group in Augusta, we did provide that context so that people don't read the story and say, these people are saying this and taking it as truth. We provide that context and make sure that their voices are heard, but that we also have information in the story.
That group in Augusta, I think there were maybe 15 or 20 of them. It was more than 3. in the rain right before Halloween.
Yeah. Which was kind of fun because they were an anti-mask group, but because it was Halloween, they were wearing masks, wearing Halloween masks. So it's kind of an interesting message.
I have a question that was just posed that is actually on the topic of anti-maskers and their protests. When you're covering a protest, as you mentioned, there was one where there were just 3 individuals there. What kind of I guess precautions, if you will, do you take in the news coverage to make sure that you're providing an accurate representation of this protest and not giving the impression that perhaps it was bigger than it was, or a particular movement isn't more significant than it actually is? You know, the concern here with this question, I think, is by providing this coverage, aren't we now providing a platform for just a small group of individuals and their message, when perhaps that cause or that message isn't shared by most of the people in Maine, and perhaps shouldn't be given the publicity that it is?
That really is a fair question. And of course, when these demonstrations and these new groups get started, we can't gauge that right away. We don't know how large the following is, but we knew in this case, this particular group also happened to be organized by a local woman. So for news purposes for the Sun Journal, it has a local angle for us. But because it was new and it was a different voice and it was fervent, we did cover them. And I think there was a peak in coverage, and I don't think we've written about them in months because the science disproves their point.
And Joe, with your work as a photographer, are there certain things that you do to try to accurately represent a particular assembly? Or if there are only 3 protesters present, for example, you know, how do you look to frame your photos and provide the context to tell the entire story, and not just perhaps have the focus on the 3 individuals and potentially give the impression that it's a bigger assembly than it may be?
At least when it was a bigger crowd, I would try to show how big the crowd was. Some of the ones at the beginning, it was really quite a spectacle. I mean, they had probably hundreds of cars driving circles around the Blaine house, and it was like tying up traffic. I talked to someone who worked in a store who was sort of on that loop, who was saying that day it was, you know, sort of the traffic was a big mess in front of them. So you try to show that the small group, you know, a small group, it's easier to show how small they are. Like some of those last couple of pictures where there are only about a dozen people in them, you could just kind of show that. It might be harder to show how big a crowd is in a picture because you can't show everything. And estimating crowd sizes is always a thing that gets people upset. I know you talk to the organizers of it, and they always say that that the crowd size is too small.
You know, I think arguably too, there's exceptions to all of our rules and decisions. And I think you could say that the greeters at the Bangor airport, that's an ongoing demonstration. And sometimes there's only one person there, but they started greeting returning soldiers because soldiers in Vietnam were not greeted warmly when they came home. That's a real political statement. And just because there aren't 200 people there every time a plane lands doesn't make it less newsworthy.
Is there any consideration that, you know, as a newspaper of record, that even if the news value is slight, you still have an obligation as a newsroom to provide some kind of coverage just to document what's going on in the communities, so people know? Again, even if the news value is slight, but to be that newsroom that can document this activity so people know, and in the future people can look back upon these particular events and have a better understanding of them.
That's what I was thinking, because some of the really big ones, or like the day after the election, I had a reporter and we were going to do a story. Some of the other ones, I went and shot them, just like you said, thinking of it as the paper of record. You would be a couple pictures inside, but just to kind of tell people that they were still out there. you know, saying their things. They were kind of a combination of the reopen anti-mask and the stop the steal at the end. The picture in the snow, there were, I don't know, 15 or 20 people, I don't remember, but there were two people with megaphones, and one kept yelling, "Joe Biden will never be president," and the other one was going on about Mills Kills Maine and talking about masks things. So it was kind of a combination of the two groups. I think they, I'm not sure who organized all of these things. You just kind of knew that they would be there every Saturday, or not every Saturday, but they would be there most Saturday. I think the crossover is kind of like they were both, Republican leaning events being, kind of for President Trump and against Governor Mills. I don't know if the party was organizing it, but that seemed to be the one thing that sort of unified the two ideas.
How do you find out about these demonstrations? Are you being contacted by those coordinating them? Did you just look out your window and see a bunch of people gathering on the street? How do you know that these protests are happening? Where and when, and how do you go about covering them?
Sometimes they would contact us, but other times you could just sort of look at their Facebook pages. I don't know if it was the group Judy was talking about. They did have a Facebook page, and you could, which has since been, I guess, blocked by Facebook, but you could kind of look at their Facebook page and they would say, that they were where they would be having their rallies and events. And
Yeah, most of these groups really do want to be heard, so they reach out and let us know what's going on a pretty regular basis.
Is there any concern among those in the newsroom that your power of pen, the power of the press, is somehow being used by these groups for more publicity? When you have people reaching out to you and asking for certain coverage and telling you about these demonstrations, how do you balance out those interests? Your interest in covering a particular protest, but also not wanting to be used by a particular organization for publicity that perhaps they wouldn't attract otherwise?
That's a fair question, because the groups do contact us for publicity. So I think that's when our news judgment has to come into play. When there's hundreds of people outside the Capitol on Saturday morning, we're going to cover that. That's news. It's interfering with traffic. It's a loud message. It's a message that a fair number of Mainers, share. But we do have to evaluate whether this is newsworthy now, today, to cover it. And often we'll ask the people who are organizing things, if we don't cover something, please stay in touch with us. Let us know if you have another event planned. We're happy to give you space on our opinion pages if you want to express yourself. There's other ways to get the message out.
I have a couple of questions here that really go into what happens after the news gathering has occurred. The first question just being simply, are these types of events more likely to get coverage on weekdays versus weekends? Is there a timing component to the coverage that you give these events? Is that a factor at all?
I wouldn't say there's a pattern necessarily. Joe, would you? I think it depends on the event, not necessarily the day that it's happening.
I was thinking the same thing, that it does kind of depend on the event, and sometimes it depends on what else is going on at the same time. Since we have a limited staff, my editors might send me to something else instead. Not that there's a basketball tournament or football games going on, but sometimes if it was just but sometimes if it was a Saturday, I might have to go do sports instead of cover something like that. But I'm not sure that it's a day, because the mask protest on Halloween, that was on a weekday, and these other ones on Saturday. Like you said, Judy, it probably depends on the event.
Mm.
Another question here. So after the news gathering is done and you're ready to go with the story or the photo, can you provide us, Judy, some insight into how the newsroom works as far as the headlines for these stories, the cut lines, the captions for the photos? Is it the reporter that's that's writing these? Is it another staff member? Ultimately, how are these stories, fully presented in the paper or online? Given the photo or the story that's been written, those headlines, really can have, I think, a very significant, make a very significant first impression on the reader. Who's responsible for them? How do those headlines and captions come about?
Well, the reporters file their stories and the photographers file their photos and write their own captions. And then all of that material is edited on the copy desk by very experienced copy editors. But then ultimately, the managing editors at night and then the senior editors and myself, we're responsible for presenting these issues factually, in context, fairly, impartially. Do we always get it right? We don't, but we work very hard and we talk about these things extensively when they're going on the page and before they get out on the street. So it's not a reporter writes a story and off it goes like you see in a TV movie. That just doesn't happen. There are multiple layers of evaluation of, are we being fair? And is this truly telling the story?
And Joe, with the photos, are you involved at all as far as how those are, the context that's provided with your photos when they're published?
If I noticed when I was going through the pictures to put them in here, if they were kind of, they call them standalone photos where it's like a couple of pictures inside the B section, I would probably write a longer caption kind of explaining that, hundreds of people were at the corner of Chamberlain and Capitol Street for another protest. And so I would, but it's not like a whole story. You get a couple sentences under a picture. And if it was something that was running with a story, I tended to just kind of say what was happening in the picture and not kind of not add more context or background to it. But like Judy was saying, there's the editors kind of take what the reporter turn in and and then it goes onto the page. I'm not in on like the discussion Judy was talking about with like senior editors deciding what we should cover or not. It sometimes kind of comes down to like, it's Saturday and you're going to do this and we go cover it and turn it in.
And I imagine, despite spending a lot of time on the context of the coverage, the headlines, the captions, and trying to be as fair about how this information is presented, no matter what you do, you're probably going to find someone who thinks that you did it wrong, you weren't fair to the cause, you're not covering the story correctly. One attendee tonight, mentions, politicians now are, of all persuasion, right, of all backgrounds are spending a lot of time blaming the media and pointing their finger at what they believe is unfair coverage. How much, if at all, does that play a role in your news coverage? The reality that no matter what you do, you're going to have some portion of the community that's going to think that they're being covered unfairly and that you're, presenting some kind of biased report, when in actuality you're spending a long time making sure that your reporting is accurate and fair and doing the contrary.
We go into every day knowing that we're not going to please everybody because there are too many opinions out there, and really this has gotten so much worse in the last several years. But we never decide coverage if we think somebody's going to call and yell at us. I mean, that's part of the deal. I've had people in the same day call and say we're too conservative and we're too liberal. We can't be both. So people come to our journalism with their own mindset, their own leanings, and they can interpret things based on their kind of set of values and their worldview. We can't even begin to recognize that in everybody. So our mission is always to be impartial and fair and check ourselves on that all the time.
But yet there still may be people that point their finger at the press and blame the media for what they see as unfair reporting. Now, Joe, you've you're on the street, you're taking photos, you're, up close and personal with a lot of community members, particularly those that are at these political demonstrations of all different causes that can become, very passionate, can become very, could become very volatile. Tell me about your experiences as a member of the press being in that atmosphere, and what kind of interactions do you have with these individuals that don't have a favorable view of the press?
Right. So dealing with people, it sort of depends on the event. A lot of times people are just kind of doing their thing. They're, chanting or waving signs or whatever they're doing, and kind of just sort of leave us alone. Like we're kind of standing up this farther up the street, watching them do that. I sometimes have had like just kind of small talk chats with people while while we're standing there, and they're, like I said, they seem sort of reasonably friendly. I think the people who are really unhappy with us, I tend to get more sort of like, I think, ignored by. I've gotten yelled at a couple of times. And that seems to have people seem to have gotten angrier over the years. I'm not sure why that is, but the country seems so polarized now that people are a lot angrier about politics than they ever used to be.
Joe, have you ever felt threatened while doing your job, or have any of your colleagues? I mean, has that animosity translated to some kind of real threat that makes doing your job more difficult?
I've never felt threatened as threatened in kind of like, I saw a lot of videos of January 6th at the Capitol in DC, where people were where insurrectionists were attacking journalists. I've never felt anything, that threatened. There's never been anything that, well, since we're not having an insurrection here, but never felt anything that's scary. The thing that sometimes worried me is getting run over more accidentally than because you're kind of standing there with a whole bunch of people on the side of the road, and people are, slowing down to either yell support or against people. That I would be, I'm sort of afraid that I'm going to get run over sometimes, depending on the situation. But I haven't felt that scared in like an insurrectionist way. But you just never know what might happen, because yeah, you just never know what might happen with people sometimes.
Judy, how about you and your experience, or others that maybe you've heard from that are reporting for you?
I know people have felt challenged, but have they felt truly in danger or threatened? I am not aware of that in any concrete way. I mean, I think there's other things journalists do that they may feel in more danger about, covering a police scene or something like that. But I also think that Mainers have a tendency to be a little more tolerant than some of the other events that we've seen around the country in these last couple of years. And I think we're fortunate to have that atmosphere here.
Got a good question here. Going to Joe's comment about watching the insurrection. I'd like to hear from both of you just what kind of consideration, if any, is given to the language that you use. This question here, I'll read it verbatim. Do you think the word insurrectionist indicates bias? And if not, how do you respond to consumers who make this or other accusations? I remember very early on in the Trump presidency, there was a lot of discussion within newsrooms about when, if ever, to use the word lie as opposed to some other term. What kind of conversations are occurring in the newsrooms, if not now, then previously, about the type of language that's used in these very volatile times, and what kind of bias, if any, that might indicate?
Well, fortunately, our newsrooms don't operate, in a vacuum. The industry talks about this all the time. The Associated Press provides style guides for us. A lot of the wire services have recommended language so that we're all using the same words for the same things to make our journalism less confusing for the reader. So I think we look at this as an industry issue, not necessarily what's going on in the Augusta newsroom. So we have colleagues we can lean on and talk about these things. Again, it always comes back to being fair and factual. And if we're using a word that doesn't fit the situation, that's where the editors come into play and they edit it out.
Yeah, and writing captions for stuff locally, I think I've only ever said protesters, since that's like the generic word for people who are peaceably assembling to, have to express their opinions.
So along these lines, I have a question here that I think really gets to it's the idea of media literacy, and really a request for help here when you have different groups of people that can see the same set of facts in very different ways. What's a protest versus an insurrection? And there are some real questions as to, well, what is actually going on? Do you have any suggestions for those that are here with us tonight about, a standard that could be used for those that want to know, well, what is the reality here? How can we cut through the spin? How can we get past the difference in language or the various perspectives that are being shared through media? How can we fully understand, well, what actually happened? Get right down to the facts. Any suggestions for those that are struggling with this?
I do think if we stay to our core of reporting the actions and avoid labels, if we describe what's happening, people will understand what's going on. And if they want to consider it an insurrection, based on what they're reading, we're presenting what happened. We're telling you so many people went up the steps, there was violence, all of that. But I think at some point too, when the reporting is repetitive day after day after day, and prosecutors are starting to use these words, then that's how we report that. But we don't necessarily do that at the start.
All right, another good question here. With the reporting itself, any consideration about the media's role in influencing the news? So for example, does covering protests increase the number of protests that then occur? Does the news that you're reporting actually reflect the reality, or is the news that you're reporting in some ways affecting what future events may be? Is there any consideration within the newsroom when it comes to your coverage about this concept that perhaps the coverage itself might be manipulating what's happening within the communities?
I do think this idea that there could be like copycat protesting, I think there's some basis for that. But by the same token, let's just say that we accept that that is true and we stop reporting on protests because we don't want to encourage others to do the same. What we're doing is silencing a group of people who have a right to protest and demonstrate, and silencing them even more than they feel silenced already. And don't we all want to know what all of the issues are, all of the facets of this, rather than just the ones that we happen to align ourselves with? It just seems irresponsible to shut down a group of people because we don't agree with them. And it's our responsibility. It's our right to report on what they're doing, and it's our responsibility to examine those voices in context. So I think ignoring them, frankly, would make it much worse.
I don't really know, but I'm not sure if whether we cover something or not matters to the people who are doing it. Because they're, in some ways, it's sort of like a meeting for them all to get together and rally and encourage each other. And it's more about sort of the camaraderie and the getting together. And if they get some coverage out of it, that might be a bonus. And also there's a lot of people who are sort of live streaming it to their supporters. it anyway, whether we're there or not. And they're kind of showing the whole thing instead of, you know, a 2-minute video or a shorter story. So I don't know if whether we cover it or not is going to stop them from having them.
And I think, you know, in the early going, in late spring and early summer, a lot of the protests in Augusta were about return to school and remote learning and parents who wanted their children back in school and wanted their children back playing sports. And there was a lot of disagreement with the stand of the parents who would be there for hours with posters and really make the case that their kids need social interaction with their peers. They need to go back to school. But the science was telling us it's not a good idea. Now we are finding out that children really do need that social interaction. This Kennebec Journal just ran a 4-piece package on mental health in our schools and how children are suffering because they're remote learning. So while we may not agree with why some of these people were protesting and their early message, the fact is, fundamentally, they were right. Children are going to suffer if we did not pay attention to this issue. And I think they were not given enough credit for that point of view, because it was seen as, oh, you want your son to play football because you don't want him to lose his scholarship. It was really about much more than that, but we didn't see that until many months later. So we don't know how these things are going to evolve in time, which is why we try to stay on top of them.
So up until this point, we've been talking about news coverage generally. I think it would be helpful if you could help us better understand the difference in coverage, or the difference in the news gathering process when it comes to print versus the online journalism. Are all the stories the same? The considerations within the newsrooms the same, depending on the various platforms where this information is going to be published? You know, where are the lines, if any, between your online and print operations when it comes to news reporting?
Well, the digital reporting is always first, and it's the first version of what will ultimately be the print version. And it's a live story, not just in terms of web, but in terms of, like, it's a living, breathing story that we're always adding to. And I think in terms of photo, and Joe can talk about this, but we can offer our readers so much more on the digital platform with photos. There's only a finite amount of space in our print products to put photos in, but online, just the video that we showed earlier gave you a sense of being there, which we cannot do in our print edition. So we do look at the coverage a little bit differently, but digital is always the first start, or it's always the start of what will ultimately be the finished print version. Does it have the eyes of all the copy editors on it? No, but they do get eyes on them.
Are there any stories that begin online but don't make it to print, or does everything that begins online ultimately evolve into a larger story that makes the print edition?
Yeah, with stories, they usually, it kind of, if it's something live, like she was saying, we might have today they opened up a mass vaccination center in a civic center, so they the reporter I was working with kind of quickly filed something right away, and then we talked to some more people later, and she added to it and made the longer version that will eventually be in print tomorrow and on the website tomorrow. So things sort of start out small and then develop into full-blown stories. And like Judy was saying, you have a lot more room to put things on the web, like with videos, which you can't do online. And also you can get a lot more pictures. You could make like a slideshow or just dot more pictures in through the story than you can online. Like we recently had a story about restaurants that opened during the pandemic, and they only had room for one picture in print, but then could run like 15 pictures from all three restaurants on the web.
All right, so if we could pivot now to get back to the local demonstration specifically, one question here has to do with hate speech, however you would define that. Are there demonstrations or protests where the message is being conveyed are too hateful or too offensive for coverage, or if you are going to cover them anyways, how do you give due consideration to those messages and cover those particular demonstrations in a way where you're not as a matter of reporting, excuse me, repeating those messages or offending your audience while doing your job?
It's very hard to do, especially visually, if there's, a hate symbol on something and it's in the middle of the crowd. But photographers have to work really hard to work around that. And those photos get a really hard look before they get in the page. And there's always a way to write around hate speech while still making the point. But it is a really tricky challenge. I know in Lewiston years ago, there was, when the Somali migration began, there were a number of hate groups that came and demonstrated in Lewiston, and we covered them because we wanted people to know that these people existed and this is their point of view. To not cover them would have been irresponsible, I believe, but we don't repeat the hate. We just cover that they are there and what they're angry about. There's a lot of finesse involved. And do we offend people sometimes? Yes. But shining a light on it is our best hope of revealing those voices, I think, and showing people that, they may not be your neighbors, but they could be in the next state, willing to come to Maine.
Joe, how about you? In your role as photographer, you're at a protest, you see a flag with some offensive symbol or some message of hate. What's going through your head as you're trying to capture this scene, knowing that these very images might be, utterly offensive to those that are going to see them the next day or who go online later that day and see your work?
I haven't seen any hate symbols like you were saying, but in the last, it's been getting worse over the last 5 or so years, is just curse words at protests. I mean, you never used to see the F word spelled out like on a sign. It was 4 years ago at one of the anti-Trump rallies at the State House. I didn't notice it until I was editing the video, but there was somebody front and center in all of my shots with it spelled out F Trump. And I had to blur that in the video. This last round, there was a lot of, F Mills and things like that, and the Trump flags that had the stop your BS or F your feelings. And you just had to avoid taking them. Would kind of wait and make sure that they were just the, Trump 2020 sign and it didn't have any curse words on it before I would take the picture. I would try to avoid it that way, but then would be careful in the editing because I'd ask my editor about that, and they were saying that we shouldn't be using those words in the pictures. So you just have to watch out for that.
Yeah, I mean, our work is to inform people, not to shock them, and we can inform them very well by working around the vulgarity and just explaining what's going on. But it can make for an awkward sentence or two sometimes.
And I'm sure these situations and conversations have come up more frequently within the last 4 years. What are some lessons both of you have learned over the course of the last 4 years, specifically during the Trump presidency, where we've seen many protests, either in support of former President Trump, the Black Lives Matter movement, protests against police brutality? Are there any specific things that you've learned during this time that you've applied to your news coverage specifically, or the context that you provide, the stories that you publish?
Oh, that's a tough question. There's so much. I've had to learn to be more patient with people who call with a piece of their mind, or who overreact or underreact to something that we're reporting. But I know I'm repeating myself here, but I think that if we stay on mission to inform our communities and reflect their values, we're doing the right thing. So we just have to stay true to that.
How about with you, Joe? What are some of the lessons that you've learned over the last 4 years covering these protests? Has your approach to the coverage changed at all? Has your perspective on your role at these demonstrations as a member of the press changed? What have you learned?
I think it's sort of been the same as it always has been. Like Judy was saying, you're trying to just sort of tell the story of what's happening. I don't know if it's more dangerous or scary. Kind of depends on the situation and who's there.
Judy, to get back to your comment about being patient with those that call with concerns about the news coverage, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, this is an effort to get into the community and provide some more understanding about how newsrooms work. But day to day, what is the best way for those in your communities that have some concerns about news coverage to get in touch either with you or others in your newsroom to express those concerns and have a productive dialogue about the way their communities are being covered? How would you suggest they proceed with those conversations?
Well, all of our contact information is on all of our websites, and we may be working remotely from our newsrooms, but we are working and we're seeing messages and willing to talk with people. And I will say that I have instructed my staff that patience only goes so far. If somebody's yelling at you and you're hearing profanity on the other end of the phone, that's not a productive conversation for anybody. But short of that, we will hear people out. I want to know what everybody in our community is thinking, because I think it informs our journalism. It makes us better journalists when we know how everyone in the community feels. And some people feel very strongly about a great many things.
How about with you, Joe, when you're on site covering a particular protest and you hear someone shout fake news at you or has some other concern about the coverage of maybe not your work specifically, but the coverage of your organization, what's the best way to have a healthy dialogue about the way the media covers Maine, in a way that would benefit everyone rather than just shouting at each other? Any suggestions or any experiences that you've had recently that you could share?
If somebody's starting to yell fake news at us, I mean, there's nothing I could say to change their mind, and they probably don't want to have a conversation. I can't. I mean, like I said, you can kind of chat with people if they're talking to you. You can kind of have a conversation. If you're talking, if there are a whole group of people marching along chanting "Go home, fake news," which happened in front of the Blaine House the Saturday after the election. It's not like you're going to change their mind, and they don't really want to have discussion. And I'm not sure it's going to change. If you had some nice chats with people just as we were standing on the sidewalk, though.
I will say, we get so many letters to the editor that are repeating bad information. And in the last several years, I've gotten in the habit of replying to many of them when they're really truly out there with correct facts. Because my worry is that this person who writes a letter is also telling 50 of their friends the same thing. And we may not run your letter, but I want that person to know that that is some story that somebody sitting in their basement made up and threw out there on the web to see if it got any traction. It's not true. So that may never get in the paper, and maybe I'll never change that person's mind, but it does make me feel a little bit better to fight against bad information with facts, because that's what we deal in. I actually have had a number of people write back and thank me because they have been sharing bad information, and it's embarrassing. So I think that's part of our job too, is to make sure that the facts are known.
I have a follow-up question to what we discussed previously about some ethics and standards within the newsroom. Both Judy and Joe, if you could provide those that don't work in a newsroom with some resources. Maybe it's just opening up an AP style book or looking at the Society of Professional Journalists list of ethical obligations. But for those that don't work in journalism and are really trying to understand why certain language is used or why coverage is made in a particular way, are there any resources that you can point them to that would give them a good journalism 101?
I think the Society for Professional Journalists would be it's a great place to start. They do have an ethics statement, and there are guidelines. And there's a lot of organizations around there. The Maine Press Association also would be a good resource for this. But the guidelines are really simple: is tell the truth, be fair, be impartial, and listen. Something that you would want all human beings to do all the time. We just have to we're professional listeners and storytellers.
What about with your work, Joe? Is there a photographer's code of ethics, for example? Is there anything that photographers specifically look to as an authority on the best way they should proceed covering a particular event?
I would just kind of go along with what Judy said. There's a National Press Photographers Association that also, like the Society of Professional Journalism, that does have, you should do things ethically.
Yeah, and we make these calls as individuals, but we also have people around us that we can talk about these things with. So this is an ongoing conversation every day with our staff. It's not something that's, printed on a piece of paper and stuck on the bulletin board. We live this every day.
So we only have a few moments left. Both Joe and Judy, if you could please just provide some final words as far as your news coverage is concerned, specific to local protests. And if you could also tell everyone who's here with us tonight the best way that you can be reached. If anybody has any follow-up questions or specific concerns that they would like to voice to you, how can they best reach you? Joe, any final words?
No, I don't have much more to add. My emails for words on them said it'd be, jphelan at mainetoday.com if anybody wanted to send me an email.
How about you, Judy?
And I would just say that I know watching protests and reading about them can be uncomfortable, and maybe we scratch our heads about why people do what they do. But every time there's a demonstration, and I'll say a peaceful demonstration, it's a celebration of our nation's history. I mean, we are a nation of protests and demonstration and social activism. This is how we got where we are. So I appreciate that when people get together and speak up, and it's our privilege to cover them.
Well, Judy, Joe, I want to thank you very much. And for everyone who's joined us this evening, thank you. I know many of us are stretched for time recently, and I appreciate everyone taking an hour of your day to join us and to learn more about journalism and how the media covers Maine. Again, I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. You can learn more about my organization at NEFAC.org. You can contact me directly at justin@nefac.org. And I also want to, again, thank you to give a thanks to the Sun Journal and the Kennebec Journal for their help with this program. They were really vital in making this happen. And we hope we have more events like this in the future. All of you who registered for this event will get a follow-up survey, and I would encourage you all to respond with your own ideas as to future programming, what topics you would like to hear about, learn about. Please let us know, and we'll do our best to make it happen. So Judy, Joe, thank you again for really pulling back the newsroom curtain and helping us all better understand how journalists are working in Maine. And to everyone else, have a good night. Thank you.